A hush fell over the auditorium as the announcer read the next name, his voice echoing across the hall. The heavy velvet curtains shivered slightly in the draft of the air vents, and the overhead lights dimmed, leaving only the stage in focus. All around, the audience stirred, the scrape of shoes against the floor, the cough of someone in the back row, and the impatient sigh of a man flipping through his program filling the silence. Then, from the side of the stage, a small figure appeared, stepping forward carefully into the glow of the spotlight. It was a girl, no taller than the piano that loomed before her, and immediately, she seemed out of place among the grand instruments, polished wood, and towering judges seated at their table. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Dressed in a simple white dress that brushed her knees, with neatly braided hair tied in blue ribbons, she looked like any other child, until you noticed her eyes. They didn't search the audience, didn't flick nervously toward the judges. Instead, they seemed to look straight through the lights, unfocused but steady. Her hand reached out into the air, fingers brushing gently against the edge of the piano as if it were a guide. The moment people realized she was blind, a wave of murmurs rolled across the auditorium like a ripple on water. A woman in the front row leaned over to whisper, her lips curling into a doubtful smile. "She can't possibly," she muttered, though she didn't finish the sentence. Two teenage boys sitting near the middle burst into hushed laughter, elbowing each other as though this was the entertainment they had been waiting for. In the back, a man chuckled audibly, shaking his head as if the whole situation were ridiculous. A blind girl playing piano? Come on, he scoffed. The whispers and smirks spread quickly, the sound swelling until it almost drowned out the announcer's final words of introduction. The girl, however, didn't flinch. She continued forward, her free hand holding onto the edge of the bench as she positioned herself. She moved slowly, carefully, as though each step had to be measured. The audience saw this, and to many, it looked like hesitation, like weakness. They judged her before she had even touched the instrument, some exchanging glances that said, "This is going to be a disaster." But what none of them noticed was the quiet strength in her shoulders, the way her chin lifted slightly, refusing to bow under the weight of their doubt. The stage lights gleamed on her dark skin, highlighting her calm expression, one that revealed neither fear nor embarrassment. She may have been small, she may have been blind, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that didn't match her age. The room was alive with expectation, but not the kind of eager anticipation reserved for talent. No, this was the restless waiting of people sure they were about to witness failure. And yet, beneath that hum of judgment, a deeper silence pressed in, heavy and watchful. Every creak of the wooden stage under her feet, every faint rustle of her dress as she moved, was amplified, as though the very air was holding its breath. She slid her fingers across the smooth edge of the piano, mapping its shape, feeling her way with an intimacy born of practice. To her, this wasn't just an instrument, it was a friend she knew better than her own reflection. But to the audience, it looked like fumbling, like a child playing dress-up in a world too big for her. The laughter grew again, low at first, then bubbling into short bursts from corners of the room. A voice rang out from the back, mocking and cruel, "She can't even see the notes." The girl paused for the briefest of moments, her back straight, her lips pressing together in silence. She heard it all, every cruel word, every mocking laugh. The noise of the crowd might as well have been a storm, crashing all around her. But she did not turn away. Instead, she reached for the piano bench, pulling it out with both hands, and slowly lowered herself onto it. The wooden legs scraped lightly against the stage floor, a sound that seemed louder than it should have in that cavernous room. Now seated, she folded her hands in her lap for a moment, taking a long, steady breath. The microphone above the piano caught the faint sound of it, broadcasting her inhale across the hushed hall. Though her eyes could not see, her ears caught everything, the coughs, the chuckles, the whispering judgments. She could feel them pressing down on her like a weight. But she had not come here to see them, nor to please them. She had come for something bigger, something the crowd could not yet understand. And as the spotlight blazed down on her small figure, the room still buzzing with disbelief, she placed her fingers gently on the keys. She pulled out the bench with both hands, her small arms straining slightly as the wooden legs scraped against the polished stage floor. The sound seemed to echo louder than it should have, a rough scratch cutting through the restless whispers of the audience. She lowered herself carefully, inch by inch, as though she was lowering herself into a world that was waiting to break her. The bright stage lights poured over her, harsh and unforgiving, revealing every detail, the neat braids tied with ribbons, the scuffed shoes that had carried her through countless rehearsals, the way her fingers trembled just slightly as she folded them in her lap. For a moment, she sat there perfectly still, her back straight, her head tilted forward as if listening to something only she could hear. The audience, however, was anything but still. Snickers bubbled up again, louder now, bolder. They saw her pause and mistook it for fear. A woman leaned to her husband and whispered with a smirk, "Poor thing, what are they even thinking letting her up there?" A teenager in the third row raised his phone, already recording, no doubt eager to capture the failure to share online. In the back, another man chuckled openly, his voice cutting across the auditorium like a knife. "She can't even see the keys," he said, and this time others laughed with him, their voices mixing into an ugly chorus of doubt. But while their words filled the air, the girl's face remained calm. Inside, she could feel her heart racing, pounding against her chest like a drum, but her expression betrayed none of it. She had heard this kind of laughter before. At school. In the street. Even from relatives who loved her but didn't believe she could succeed in music. She had grown used to it. The disbelief, the doubt, the mockery. And yet, every time, she had answered with the same thing, the piano. She reached forward slowly, extending her hands as if she were greeting an old friend. Her fingertips brushed against the cool, smooth ivory of the keys, and instantly, her breathing slowed. The crowd couldn't see it, but in that moment, the storm inside her quieted. She didn't need her eyes. The piano was her map, her voice, her freedom. Each key was as familiar to her as the sound of her own mother's voice. She knew their distance, their weight, their feel. She could play them in the dark, in silence, even in her dreams. And tonight, she would show the world. She lifted her chin slightly, as though daring the crowd to keep laughing. Her small hands rested in position, her fingers curved with confidence. She waited one breath longer, letting the tension build, letting the audience think they were right, letting them believe they were about to witness a mistake. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the occasional cough or stifled giggle. Somewhere in the room, a judge leaned forward, his pen tapping against the table, ready to write down a score that he was already sure would be low. Then she pressed down. 3 simple notes rang out, clear and sharp, resonating through the entire hall. It was not clumsy. It was not weak. It was bold. Strong. Intentional. The sound filled every corner of the auditorium, bouncing off the walls, wrapping around the very people who had doubted her. The mocking laughter that had been bubbling in the back row stopped instantly. Heads lifted. Eyes widened. The judges froze mid-motion. For a fraction of a second, the entire room was stunned into silence, as though those 3 notes had struck not only the piano, but the very hearts of everyone listening. She held her fingers steady on the keys for just a moment longer, letting the vibration of the chords hang in the air. The sound shimmered and lingered, refusing to be ignored. For the first time since she walked onto that stage, the whispers vanished. The cruel chuckles faded. The smirks slipped away. Every eye was locked on her, not with ridicule now, but with shock. It was as though the world had tilted, and the crowd was suddenly seeing her for the first time. A faint smile touched her lips. She hadn't even begun to play yet, but already, she had silenced them. Her fingers, once trembling, now flowed with certainty across the keys. The first chord had been her opening statement, a declaration that she belonged here, and what followed was nothing short of breathtaking. With each note, her body seemed to loosen, her shoulders straightening, her movements more fluid, as though she was no longer a nervous child on a stage but a master storyteller with a language all her own. The melody swelled, gentle at first, like the opening of a dawn sky, then grew bolder, brighter, filling every empty space in the hall. It wasn't just music, it was emotion transformed into sound. Every press of a key carried pieces of her struggles, her laughter, her nights of practicing alone in her room while others doubted her. The audience, once so eager to dismiss her, now leaned forward unconsciously, their eyes fixed on the girl they had mocked only moments ago. A man who had been laughing the loudest earlier now sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his phone still raised but forgotten, recording what was no longer a joke but history in the making. A woman clasped her hands together, tears forming in her eyes as the melody wrapped itself around her heart. Parents in the crowd looked at their own children, suddenly ashamed of the smirks they had shared earlier. One by one, the whispers of mockery turned into whispers of disbelief, not at her failure, but at her brilliance. Her hands danced. That was the only word for it. They leapt and glided over the keys like they were guided by something divine, something bigger than herself. She couldn't see the piano, but she didn't need to. She knew where every key lived, where every note belonged, the way some people know the shape of their own name. And she played not with the stiff precision of someone trying to prove themselves, but with the natural grace of someone who had nothing left to prove at all. The music wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about telling the truth. The judges, who had been skeptical at best, now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The one who had tapped his pen earlier dropped it entirely, his eyes wide, his expression unreadable. Another judge leaned forward so close to the table it looked as if she might climb onto the stage just to see better. Their pens, once ready to score her low, now hovered in midair, useless. Numbers and grades could not capture what was unfolding in front of them. This was not just a performance. This was a moment. And still, she played on. Her fingers struck chords that soared high, then dipped low, weaving between joy and sorrow, triumph and pain. It was as if she was letting the world peek into her soul. The audience could feel it. They could feel the nights she stayed awake, replaying notes in her mind when she couldn't practice. They could feel the sting of laughter, the weight of doubt, the loneliness of being told she couldn't. They could feel the hope that kept her moving forward anyway. Every note she played was an answer to the cruel voices that said, "You can't." And every note said clearly, "I can." The silence in the room had transformed into something else entirely, not just quietness, but reverence. A reverence that hung thick in the air, as if the audience was afraid to even breathe too loudly in case they disturbed the magic. The teenager who had been recording lowered his phone slowly, realizing that what he was witnessing wasn't meant to be mocked online, but remembered forever. An older man in the back wiped his eyes, embarrassed at his own earlier cruelty. Even the children in the crowd, who had laughed because they didn't know better, sat cross-legged in their seats, their eyes wide, their little mouths open in awe. As the music built toward its peak, her face tilted upward, and for the first time, she looked utterly free. She wasn't just playing the piano anymore, she was soaring. The instrument had become an extension of her, the stage had become her world, and the laughter of moments ago had been reduced to dust. The girl who had walked onto that stage under the weight of so much doubt was gone. In her place sat a young legend, her music echoing through every corner of the room, binding every heart to hers. And when the final ripple of notes spilled into the air, the hall was no longer filled with laughter, but with stunned silence, silence heavy with awe, heavy with something none of them had expected to feel. For a heartbeat after the last note faded, there was nothing. No clapping, no whispering, no sound at all, just the heavy silence of an entire room holding its breath. She kept her fingers resting on the keys, feeling the final vibration shiver through them, as if reluctant to let go. Her chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. For a moment, she wasn't even on stage anymore, she was still inside the music, inside the world she had built with her hands. She let the silence stretch, let it wrap around her like a curtain. And then, gently, she lowered her hands into her lap. It was as if that small movement shattered the spell. The audience, stunned into silence only seconds ago, now erupted with a roar so loud it seemed to shake the very walls of the hall. Applause thundered through the air, echoing off every surface, crashing like waves against the stage. People shot to their feet, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor as one by one, then row by row, the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation. The sound was deafening, cheers, whistles, shouts of bravo, and amazing, mingling into one unstoppable storm of praise. The same people who had laughed at her, who had mocked her for daring to sit at that piano, now clapped until their palms burned. The man who had scoffed, "She can't even see the keys," was on his feet, his face flushed red with both shame and awe as he clapped louder than anyone else. The teenager who had raised his phone for ridicule was now crying quietly, the phone still in his hand but forgotten as he wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Even the judge who had tapped his pen impatiently before now stood, his jaw tight, his hands coming together in applause he had no choice but to give. She sat there, still and quiet, as the wave of praise washed over her. She tilted her head slightly, listening not just to the volume of the applause but to what it meant. This wasn't just clapping. It was surrender. It was the crowd admitting they had been wrong. It was the sound of hundreds of people acknowledging her power, her courage, her gift. And though she could not see the faces in front of her, she could feel the weight of their respect pressing against her like sunlight breaking through clouds. Tears began to flow in the audience, and not just from children or sentimental souls. Hardened men who had folded their arms in doubt minutes earlier were dabbing their eyes, overcome by what they had witnessed. Mothers hugged their children tighter, whispering into their ears, "Remember this. Don't ever laugh at someone who's trying." Teachers in the crowd scribbled mental notes, thinking of the students they had underestimated. Even strangers who had never once spoken to each other exchanged glances, nodding in shared understanding. They all knew they had seen something unforgettable, something bigger than just a song. The ovation did not die quickly, it rolled and rolled, an endless tide of gratitude and awe. People clapped long after their arms grew tired, clapped long after the first few tears had dried on their cheeks. And on stage, the girl finally smiled, a soft curve of her lips, small but radiant. It wasn't a smile of arrogance, or even of victory. It was the smile of someone who had carried a heavy weight of doubt for far too long, and who had finally laid it down. The judges, who had tried to remain composed, could no longer hide their emotions. One leaned forward, her hand pressed tightly against her heart, her eyes shimmering with tears. Another scribbled furiously, but it wasn't numbers or scores he was writing, it was notes, words trying to capture what could not be quantified. And the third, the one who had been skeptical from the start, stood the tallest of them all, clapping with a face that was both humbled and inspired. When the ovation finally began to ebb, when the cheers softened into murmurs and sniffles, the girl rose slowly from the bench. She reached forward, feeling the piano with her fingertips one last time, as though saying goodbye to a dear friend. Then she turned toward the sound of the crowd, bowed low and graceful, and straightened with quiet dignity. The spotlight bathed her in golden light, making her appear less like a child and more like a figure carved in legend. In that moment, she didn't need to see the crowd. She already knew. She knew she had won, not just their applause, not just their respect, but something deeper. She had shown them all that blindness was not weakness, that laughter could be silenced with courage, that talent had no boundaries. And as the audience erupted one final time into cheers, the girl stood tall on that stage, no longer just a contestant, no longer just a blind child, but a name and a story that none of them would ever forget. Long after the applause began to fade and the audience reluctantly filed out of the auditorium, the memory of what had just happened lingered in the air like perfume that refused to disappear. People walked slower than usual, talking in hushed voices as if they were afraid to disturb the magic they had just witnessed. Parents leaned down to their children, their words filled with awe. Did you see her? Did you hear that? Never forget tonight. Teenagers who had laughed earlier now walked in silence, their phones clutched loosely in their hands, knowing deep down that no video could ever truly capture what they had felt in that room. Even the skeptics, the ones who had doubted her the most, carried an invisible weight in their chests, an uncomfortable mix of shame and admiration, the kind that changes people forever. On stage, the girl lingered for just a moment more. The lights still blazed down, but she no longer felt small beneath them. She reached again for the edge of the piano, her fingers brushing gently against its polished surface, as if to thank it for standing beside her in battle. She didn't think of the cruelty or the laughter anymore. That was behind her. What mattered was that she had spoken, and the world had listened. Her music had cut through prejudice, through ignorance, through doubt, and left nothing but truth in its place. As she was guided backstage, the crew members and staff, people who had seen countless performers pass through, stopped in their tracks to applaud her quietly, respectfully. One woman whispered, "Legend, she's a legend already." Another man, his voice thick with emotion, said, "That girl didn't just play music tonight. She changed lives." She couldn't see their faces, but she felt their sincerity in every word, every hand on her shoulder, every small cheer as she passed. For the first time, she allowed herself to exhale fully. Meanwhile, in the audience, something remarkable was happening. The performance had ended, but the story was only beginning. Strangers who had never exchanged words before were now speaking with each other, united by what they had witnessed. Teachers whispered about bringing her story back to their classrooms. Parents promised to remind their children never to laugh at someone chasing their dream. Musicians, both young and old, felt a spark reignite inside them, a reminder of why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. And tucked into the corner, a journalist scribbled furiously, already drafting headlines that would carry this girl's name far beyond the walls of that auditorium. She, however, wasn't thinking of headlines. She wasn't thinking of going viral, of being remembered as a sensation. All she thought about as she sat backstage with her hands folded in her lap was how good it had felt to play, to really play, freely, without fear. She thought about her mother's words, whispered to her every night, "Your gift will speak louder than any laughter." Tonight, those words had come true. And perhaps the most powerful part of the night was not the ovation or the tears or even the music itself, it was the shift that happened in the hearts of those who watched. The ones who had laughed learned humility. The ones who had doubted learned belief. And the ones who had supported her all along felt their faith vindicated, stronger than ever. The story of a blind black girl who silenced a mocking crowd with her first chord would spread, not just as entertainment, but as a lesson. A reminder that greatness can come from where it is least expected, and that talent knows no boundaries of sight, color, or circumstance. In the years to come, people would still talk about that night. Some would say, "I was there." Others would watch clips online, their jaws dropping as if they too had been seated in the front row. And many children, especially those who had ever been laughed at, doubted, or underestimated, would find courage in her story, courage to step up to their own stage, whatever it may be, and show the world what they could do. But for her, the girl at the piano, it was simpler. She didn't need to be called a legend, though she was. She didn't need to be remembered forever, though she would be. She only needed the knowledge that she had done what she came to do. She had turned laughter into silence, silence into music, and music into something eternal. And as she rested her hands in her lap, smiling faintly in the quiet of backstage, she knew she had written her own ending, not as a blind girl mocked for daring, but as a musician whose music had changed everything.